Excellent. All right. In that case, I'll start. So big thanks to the crypto community for inviting me. You guys have the distinction of being the first Swiss meetup to invite me to speak, and also the additional distinction of being the first meetup altogether to invite me to speak a second time. Um, the message I received from that second invitation is that the first talk was not technical enough. So this time I will be sure to dissuade you from inviting me a third time. Um, so I'll be speaking about privacy coins today, and the original title was Monero and MimbleWimble, or that's the subtitle, but I actually added a third one, proposal for a private coin called QuizQuiz, because it relies on similar technology, and since I'm already talking about this technology, I might as well cover that one as well. So in terms of the outline for this talk, the first few minutes is really just random moral philosophy about privacy and why privacy might not be as bad as you were taught to think. And then after that, I'm going to start making things a little bit more technical and try to philosophize about how should we think about privacy in a way that we can actually engineer for. And then in the third portion of the talk, I'll actually look at the concrete engineering design choices made by various cryptocurrency proposals to provide privacy for transactions. And then the conclusion slide is just one slide, but I did manage to integrate everything into one beautiful slide, and I'm actually happy to have made the conclusion slide because writing this presentation forced me to articulate a lot of thoughts, and the conclusion slide in particular got me to a clear understanding of where I stand in terms of privacy coins. And well, I probably wouldn't have been able to articulate it as clearly had you guys not invited me. So thanks to you once again there. So I originally started with a whole list of moral arguments and non-arguments that I wanted to debunk. But then I decided after answering these points already that maybe in the interest of time, I shouldn't be exhaustive. So I'll just offer some moral points and counterpoints with respect to these points, with respect to these bullet points. And well, if you want to hear more moral philosophy from me, then please hit me up after the presentation. So the first point is the nothing to hide non-argument. The idea is you shouldn't care about privacy because good people have nothing to hide. And if you do have something to hide, well then obviously you do care about privacy, but you're not a good person, so we shouldn't care about your opinion. I think this point has been very well rebutted by one of the most articulate advocates for privacy that I know of, which is Edward Snowden. And he says, saying you don't care about privacy because you have nothing to hide is like saying you don't care about free speech because you have nothing to say. And the idea here is that privacy isn't just about hiding bad stuff. So there is an implied connection here between something that's worthy to hide and something that's bad. And I think Edward Snowden is alluding to the fact that this is actually a non-implication. So in order to decide whether this implication holds, you need to ask additional questions and answer these additional questions, like worthy of hiding from whom? You might be perfectly willing to share something with your spouse, but maybe not with someone else. something bad according to whom? Someone has to decide what is bad and what is good, and maybe you don't trust that person. And also maybe you don't trust, maybe you do trust them now, but not in the future. Um, so in order to protect yourself, for instance, against immoral laws that are passed in the future, maybe you want to use privacy now. Because this day and age, all the internet traffic is being recorded, as we know, thank you, Edward Snowden. So if you don't protect your privacy now, you're not going to have it in the future either. And maybe the legal landscape is less friendly in the future. Here's a point about freedom of speech. The idea is freedom of speech and freedom of expenditure, in my opinion, is equivalent. You cannot have freedom of speech without freedom of expenditure, and you cannot have freedom of expenditure without freedom of speech. And so mathematically, if you want to prove such an equivalence, you have to show two things. Firstly, freedom of speech implies freedom of expenditure, and this is obvious in the context of Bitcoin, because in order to make a Bitcoin expenditure, you broadcast your transaction to the rest of the world. That's a form of speech. So if you have freedom of speech, then you can make expenditures. And for the reverse implication, I would look at controversial platforms, or rather platforms for controversial content. Because people want them not to host controversial content, and they will try to attack those platforms and make it difficult for them to exist. And as a result, they need funding. And these people, by the way, this gives rise to another argument in favor of privacy, because the mob that wants to take down the controversial information available from platforms, they're going after the platforms, and if they can't go after the platforms, they'll go after the payment service. And if they can't go after the payment service, they're coming after you. So maybe if you want to support these controversial platforms, you should consider supporting them in using a payment method that actually protects your privacy. But the privacy argument is different from the reverse implication, which holds because platforms offering controversial material often need financial support. All right, so in this next argument, I'd like to look at money laundering. And it's difficult in general to say whether something is good or bad, because that involves a lot of arbitrary value judgments. But I did think for a while about the question, what do we require in order to put someone in jail, or in order to escalate violence, in order to prevent someone from doing something, or capture them after the fact? And we actually require a very strong criterion before this contravening action is justified. We want the suspect to be involved in a significant link in a chain of causes and effects that is understandable, clear, and definite, that results in material harm or invasion of body or property. If that is satisfied, then you can go capture your suspects, put them in jail, try them, whatever. On the other hand, sometimes there is not really a link of causes and effects that lead to a crime, or rather, the proposed link of events is really up to discussion, or a subject of discussion. And in those cases, there is no culpability. So for instance, the United States Supreme Court remember that the United States is where the First Amendment guarantees the freedom of speech, but even the Supreme Court there has decided that there are cases where freedom of speech is limited. For instance, you cannot command someone to kill an innocent person, I guess. You can command someone to kill in self-defense, but that's not the argument I'm making here. You cannot command someone to kill because that command is causing them to kill. Therefore, you are causing murder, and therefore you are culpable of murder. Similarly, you cannot give a speech to a crowd to incent them to riot, because then you are causing the riot and your cause in all the damage that results from that. And in a similar vein, I would cite transporting goods that are needed to commit a crime to the scene of the crime, even though you don't break the vault yourself. If you provide the bank robber with the angle grinder, then you're culpable. On the other hand, there are certain non-crimes, in my opinion. All of this is opinion. Obviously, some of these things can be crimes in the eyes of the law, but in my opinion, they're not crimes because they don't satisfy this requirement of a clear chain of events, chain of causes and effects. So, for instance, hate speech, the idea is crappy speech causes people to radicalize and do harmful things. And the problem is that that's just really a very cloudy non-chain of events. There's so much conjecture, so many other ways things could have gone, and there is no identifiable chain to begin with. So therefore, hate speech, people cannot be culpable for hate speech. Internet piracy I included because there is no material harm to body or property. Selling knives is another example of the cloudy non-chain of causes and effects, because the person who sells the knife cannot possibly know what the buyer of the knife is going to do with that. So how could he be culpable if that knife is being used to commit a murder? If the knife seller didn't sell the knife to the murderer, someone else would have. So the chain is neither sufficient nor necessary. Chain. And based on this distinction, I would put money laundering in the right column and not in the left column, because it's much more of a cloudy, up for debate link of causes and effects rather than a concrete argument you can make in a court in order to jail someone. And in order to argue that money laundering belongs in the right column, let's strengthen the argument against money laundering a bit. So the idea is we have an assassin who commits a murder, gets paid for the murder, whitewashes his money with the laundromat, and uses the whitewashed money to buy the tools for the next murder with which he will repeat the cycle. So this is not just whitewashing the proceeds of one crime, this is enabling the next crime to take place. All right? Clearly, or rather, arguably, the laundromat is a link in a chain of causes and effects that enables the continued commission of crime, right? Well, I'd argue that this picture is actually inaccurate because it's only an effective laundromat for whitewashing money if there are other incoming streams and outgoing streams of money. And it so happens that there can be legitimate reasons to whitewash your money, or rather to obscure the origin of money. For instance, if you want to donate to charity, there should be nothing wrong with doing so anonymously. In fact, you could even argue that it is only virtuous if your reputation is not benefiting from this donation. Another example is where you want to support a controversial platform like WikiLeaks or Patreon even, whatever. And probably the most important reason why you would want to obscure money or sources and destinations and locations of money is to protect yourself from theft. You should not have to have a justification to protect yourself from theft, and one of the easiest and most straightforward ways to do that is to not be known to the attacker. So there are likely to be other incoming and outgoing streams into this laundromat that precisely obscure the chain of causes and effects. So in order to make this picture more accurate, we would have to replace the laundromat by a cloud. And since a cloud is actually a necessary part of the entire picture, how can it possibly satisfy the concrete, clear link of the left column on the previous slide? Obviously, it's the right column because that's involving the cloud. Here's another argument based on Economics 101, where we have the demand curve sloping down, meaning that at a higher price there will be less demand, and the supply curve is sloping up. At a higher price there will be more supply. And the point where demand meets supply, that will be the market price. And the argument is, once we allow KYC/AML regulations to take over, suppliers who have to comply with these regulations, well, some of them still will, but others will be disincentivized, so there will be less supply. And similarly, people who would otherwise buy a service or good and now have to comply with KYC/AML regulations, they might think, yeah, it's not worth it. So in other words, there will be less demand. And as a result, there will be less prosperity, because in the end, the point where demand and supply curves meet is at a lower price, or is at the same price maybe, but at a lower quantity. And as a result, we're all less prosperous. Now, this is a very, very, very abstract argument, but the point is that maybe we want to be more prosperous. Maybe KYC is stopping, for instance, a cure for cancer to be developed, from being developed. So the next time someone tells me KYC is necessary, I'll tell them, do you want cancer? So those were the moral arguments. Here's some more philosophy, but more about the practical aspects and how to think about privacy in an engineering context, not so much a moral context. Firstly, it's really, really difficult to define privacy. And researchers have struggled with that question as well. And then there's this one law professor, I think, who defined privacy as the appropriate flow of information. And I think this is a very, very good first attempt, because it captures certainly a subjective aspect that a violation of privacy in one context might not be a violation of privacy in another context. Unfortunately, subjectivity is not very useful from a technical point of view. And there's this other researcher who proposed another definition of privacy, the non-disclosure of discriminatory information. What I mean by this is any information that allows the attacker to pinpoint you as opposed to anyone else. That's discriminatory information because it discriminates between yourself and other targets, and you are protecting your privacy when you do not disclose such information. So this is definitely technical, but it's not capturing adequately other non-technical aspects of what we consider to be privacy. So maybe it's less accurate, but at least it's workable. All right. In the context of privacy coins and cryptocurrencies, there is really no shortage of properties like plausible deniability, uncensorability, pseudonymity, unlinkability. And if you have pseudonymity and unlinkability, then you have anonymity. Confidentiality is not one thing, but plenty of things, right? Because it's confidentiality of the amount, the source, the destination. And then there's unobservability. This is what you get when there are dummy transactions that distract the attacker from authentic transactions, with the effect that the attacker doesn't even know that you spent something, or that anybody at all spent something. You would also want to hide implementation details, and I think this qualifies as privacy, but, well, it's certainly qualifies for privacy under my definition, which is anything that gives the attacker something to work with. And there are plenty of implementation details that you would want to hide, like what hardware are you running, what software are you running, which client, what is your connectivity like to the rest of the network. Even your memory access pattern has been used to break the anonymity of Zcash, which is surprising, but obviously once you think about it, it takes a lot longer if you have to, if it takes a lot longer to respond to particular queries if you own coins that the attacker is referring to. This list is by no means exhaustive, but it's a good list to explain that there are many aspects. And we can already look, how does Bitcoin score on this scoreboard? And I would say not too well. There is a certain aspect of plausible deniability, right? Because even if someone obtains information that you had Bitcoin in the past, and even if they know that you didn't spend it between then and now, you can always say, I lost my Bitcoin in a tragic boating accident. There is rather strong uncensorability because, well, the miners would have to act against their own self-interest in order to suppress your transactions. And there is pseudonymity. You can generate a new address just like that, no problem at all. There is no unlinkability. So that's the way Bitcoin works. Everything is put into a public ledger where you can trace all the transactions. That's how Bitcoin does its auditing. And so on. I will be speaking in the sequel about confidentiality of amount, source, and destination. I'm going to touch on unobservability as well, but I'm definitely hiding the of the implementation details. But it's worth remembering that once you have confidentiality of amount, source, and destination, then you have unlinkability. And since we already have pseudonymity, then we have anonymity. All right. How do we think about anonymity? I used Waldo for the title of this slide, but you can think of it as where is the sum of money that I'm looking for. So substitute sum of money for Waldo, and the question is just as good. So there are 4 potential locations of Waldo, and the attacker is, in this case, pretty certain that the money, or that Waldo is hiding in Alice's apartment. And I'd say this is the prototypical case of terrible, terrible anonymity. Alice wants to hide behind Bob, Charlie, and David, but she's not doing a very good job because the attacker knows exactly who to target. So let's improve this. We can spread out using fancy cryptography technology. We can engineer the system, or engineer the observables of the system, so that the information that the attacker obtains from making his observations isn't absolute. He only obtains, at best, a probability distribution of possible locations for Waldo. Well, this is certainly a lot better, because Alice is hiding somewhat behind Bob and Charlie, but she's not hiding at all behind David, and still she's the most likely candidate, even more likely than half. So I'd still say this is terrible anonymity. But we can continue spreading out, and the end point of that spreading out is where the probability is 1/4 over all 4 locations, and this is still terrible anonymity. Why is this terrible anonymity? Well, think about it. Alice is hiding behind 3 other users. That's not very smart. So the problem here is that there are just too few users to offer meaningful privacy. So let's increase the number of users. I would say this picture actually offers better privacy than this picture, even though it's not uniformly distributed. Because Alice, which I guess is the leftmost bar, has managed to spread out the likelihood of being targeted over many more users. And yet I'd still say this is terrible anonymity, because there are only 16 bars. 16 is quite terrible. Here I drew a picture with too many bars to distinguish individual bars. This I like. This is the kind of thing that has my lukewarm approval. Why lukewarm? Well, because we can do a lot better, right? So what if, in addition to legitimate transactions, we include illegitimate transactions, just to distract the attacker? We screw with him a bit. The attacker should have no capability of deciding which transactions are authentic and which are dummy transactions. And so he'll be distracted by all these decoys and have no idea whether you're actually spending something or whether it was just a decoy. So in this picture, half of the transactions is untargetable dummy transactions, which is pretty good, not bad. But there's no reason why it shouldn't be more than half. So I'd say this is better. This is actually pretty good. And then, well, there might be a reason why it shouldn't be the overwhelming majority, and the reason for that is because of scalability. But in terms of privacy, this is the ideal scenario. So about scalability then, there is a problem here. The way Bitcoin and most cryptocurrencies work is they store a graph of transactions, and whenever there is a new transaction that you need to verify, you don't need to look at every node in this graph of transactions. The only thing you need to do is you need to store the endpoints of this graph. That's called the unspent transaction output set. And you can verify new transactions very efficiently against these endpoints. This is a scalability mechanism because you can forget about the history after you've computed the UTXO set. The problem, though, is supposing we have perfect privacy and no single transaction is linkable to any other transaction, how does anybody verify a new transaction? How does anybody prove that they were even allowed to make this transaction? Well, there are cryptographic tools that allow you to prove something and still hide sensitive details. But the point is there are many, many, many links that would be involved in such a proof and in the verification of such a proof. Because this one new transaction has to be linked somehow to a way more previous transactions than the Bitcoin node needs to remember, because the Bitcoin node can use the UTXO set. So there seems to be a big problem in terms of scalability. You cannot forget history. So the big question is, how do you marry scalability with privacy? And raising that question is actually a good dimension by which to categorize different privacy coins, namely, how do they marry scalability and privacy? So the first proposal for privacy coins was ZeroCoin, and they achieve scalability through RSA accumulators. Then there was Zerocash, which then turned into the coin Zcash, and they use zero-knowledge snarks for scalability instead of accumulators. And then there was Monero, and I would characterize Monero's strategy as using an explicit list of decoy transactions. And then there is MimbleWimble, and MimbleWimble's strategy for achieving scalability is cut through, and people mistake the technology for scalability as one for privacy, which is not entirely inaccurate, because the two are two sides of the same coin. And then QuizQuiz, which is the last technology that I'll be covering in this presentation, achieves privacy through UTXO set randomization. And since they have a UTXO set, they manage to recycle a lot of the scalability that Bitcoin already offers. So I will not be talking about the blue lines today, because the technology involved there is very, very different, whereas the technology involved in the green lines is all rather similar. However, if you're interested in the type of research that I do, it's mostly the technology that's involved in the blue lines. And interestingly, people like to criticize ZeroCoin and Zcash because they require a trusted setup, and in an untrusted cryptocurrency, why would you sacrifice that principle that you don't have to trust anybody? But actually, recent years have shown that we can achieve both accumulators and zero-knowledge snarks without trusted setups. So that's a very small insight into the type of research that I find really exciting. So on to Monero and other technologies. It all starts with elliptic curves. And the credit goes to someone on the internet who wrote a blog post, and I don't remember the name, and I don't remember the URL or title of the blog post, but he described, or she described, for all I know, elliptic curves as pool tables. And I thought that was an amazing description, so I'll just adopt that and say sorry, internet, for the lack of credits. So the idea is we're going to play a game, which is very, very similar to pool, except the pool table has this weird shape, which is the shape of an elliptic curve. And we're going to shoot one ball, the turquoise ball, at the dark yellow ball. And the way the balls bounce off the table here is you draw a straight line, and the shape of the table, the curve, guarantees that any straight line intersecting it in 2 points will intersect the curve in a third point. So you draw a straight line between the two balls on the table, and you look where does it intersect with the curve, and you flip that point about the y-axis. That gives you the new location of the yellow ball. So then you forget about the old location of the yellow ball, and then you play again. You shoot the blue ball in the direction of the purple ball. This intersects with the curve in exactly 1 point because of mathematics. And we flip this point about the y-axis, thereby getting the new location of the yellow ball. So we can play this game on and on and on and on, and it totally works. And the only thing that you need to know about this game is how many times you've played it. There is a complicating factor, which is not really that much complicating. So I showed you how to add 2 points, which is one iteration of playing the game. And based on the structure of the graph, you can probably intuit a similar way to add a single ball to itself or a single point to itself. So I showed you the formula for adding 2 points on the curve, and there is a similar formula for doubling a point on the curve. And it turns out that with these two formulas, we can play the game a very large number of times in a very short amount of time. Because what you do is you take the binary expansion of this very hugely large integer, and based on that binary expansion, you choose for the one formula or the other, and you keep repeating it. And you only have a logarithmically many steps that you need to make before you've played the game the equivalent of that many times. And I drew a reasonably large number for a presentation here, but in practice, the number would be larger than the width of my slide. And we can still compute what is the location of the ball at the end of that many iterations of playing the pool game. That's totally easy because we have these two formulas. What's not easy is going the other way around. So here we're going from an integer and a point on the curve to another point on the curve. But if we want to go the other way around, then we get 2 points on the curve, and the question is, what is the integer that sends 1 point to the other? And that's really, really difficult. The best strategy is, well, maybe not trying naively, but it's not much better than trying naively to play the game of pool on expectation that many times before you discover, hey, this is exactly the right location. So this is all you need to know about elliptic curve cryptography, right? You need the rules to add, but even that is kind of abstract. What you need to know is that these things apply to numbers, integer numbers, which you can think of as the number of times we played the game of pool. And all your intuition about integer numbers, which you already have because you already went to school, applies to the cryptography that we build on top of elliptic curves. So for instance, let's have a look at the Schnorr signature scheme. So there is a designated point called G on the curve, and everybody agrees on that. That's the assumption. And in order to generate a public key, you sample a secret key, which is just an iteration number. That's the number of times you're going to play the game. And after playing the game that many times, you get your public key, which is another point on the curve. And you can compute this multiplication because, well, because of those two rules that I showed on the last slide. And it's difficult to get x back from P and G because the discrete logarithm problem is hard. That was exactly the hard problem I showed on the previous slide. So this is all pretty good, but how do signatures work? Well, before I get to signatures, let's look at the identification protocol, where we have the user and the verifier, and sometimes they call the user P for prover. The prover wants to show to the verifier that he knows X such that X times G gives his public key. But he doesn't want to disclose what X is because that would make it useless afterwards. And a person called Klaus-Peter Schnorr back in 1990 came up with a very elegant solution to this. The prover selects a random integer and plays the game of pool that many times, starting from the original point G. That gives a new point on the curve, R. And R is the first message in the protocol that's going to convince the verifier that he knows X. The verifier responds with a random integer E, and the prover performs one multiplication and one addition of integers. And that's the response in the last message of the protocol. The whole point is that this multiplication and addition of integers can be verified by the verifier by operating on elliptic curve points. What this represents is a number of times of playing the pool game, and this is actually playing the pool game. But it's still the same thing. So how do we turn this into a signature scheme? Well, the problem of using it directly as a signature scheme is that there's interaction. So we have to eliminate this interaction. And the way we do that is we replace the random challenge coming from the verifier with the hash of all relevant information. So the only thing that this protocol requires from E is that the prover cannot predict what E is going to be. If the prover can predict what E is going to be, then he can forge proofs and forge signatures and so on. But actually computing E as the hash of all relevant information satisfies the same requirement. The prover still cannot predict E ahead of time because he cannot invert hashes. So that's the signature scheme, right? Everything you need to know is on the slide. The signature itself is the two messages that are sent in the protocol, R and S. R is the point on the curve, S is the integer. And in order to verify the signature, the verifier is just going to run this formula again, right-hand sides, and in the place of E, he's actually going to use this hash value, but it's the same thing. So this is Schnorr's signature scheme, and I verified that the names of the symbols actually match the names of the symbols in the Bitcoin proposal. So with some luck, Bitcoin will actually adopt this proposal as well in the not too far future. So that's nice, but it's not good enough. For me, nothing is good enough. So let's try to build on top of this protocol and achieve fancier things. So what is it that it achieves exactly? Well, it shows that the prover knows something, and then in this case, it shows that the prover knows the private key, which is an integer, that sends a parameter, public parameter G, which is a point on the curve, to his public key, which is also a point on the curve. And we can identify properties, security properties, that this protocol provides. Completeness means that if the prover actually does know his secret key, then he will succeed in convincing the verifier. Soundness means that if the prover is trying to fool the verifier but actually does not know the private key, then he will fail in convincing the verifier. And zero knowledge means that he's not leaking any information about his secret key. And we can actually change this claim of knowledge while keeping the security properties intact. So instead of saying, I know X such that X number of iterations sends G to P, you can say, I know two integers, X and Y, such that X number of iterations starting from G and Y number of iterations starting from H gives rise to a third point which I neglected to put on the slide. That's one possibility. Another claim of knowledge could be, I know these two numbers and X belongs in this range, which is actually what Monero uses when it needs to show that certain numbers are not negative. Another possible claim is, I know a number X such that X sends G to P1 or to P2 or to P3, but I'm not telling you which one of these public keys is mine. And this list is by no means exhaustive. All these claims can be computed, represented by a computer program, and any computer program can be turned into a protocol that convinces a verifier that the computer program was run correctly, even while it keeps certain inputs secret from the verifier. There is a price to pay, and this price is typically you have a few more rounds of interactions in your protocol. That doesn't matter in practice, though, because earlier I showed you how to replace the random challenge from the verifier with the hash of all relevant information. The only requirement is that the prover cannot predict this random challenge. So you can keep applying this transformation, replacing random challenges from the verifier with the hash of all relevant information, and in the end you still have a non-interactive protocol. It'll just be a little bit larger because we have more rounds in order to accommodate more complex computations. And this is what's called bulletproofs. So bulletproofs achieve more interesting computations than just Schnorr signatures. All right. Now I think we have enough background to look at the first technology that actually is capable of preserving some privacy in cryptocurrencies, namely confidential transactions. So we have here a transaction. This is a typical transaction with two incoming wires and two outgoing wires. And the transaction is valid if the sum of inputs equals the sum of outputs. And since these wires are labeled with those amounts, in order to verify that it is valid, you add these two and you subtract those two and you verify that the difference is equal to 0. Of course, this does not preserve privacy at all because you just trace the amounts and then obtain your targets. In confidential transactions, these amounts are hidden. And in order to verify the correctness of this transaction, you have to run some kind of cryptographic operations that match the verifier from the previous slide. So let's look at this in more detail. We have a transaction with two incoming wires and two outgoing wires. And the value that's on those wires is not an amount, but it's a single point on the curve, which represents an encryption of the amount. So the amounts are A1, A2, A3, A4 are amounts. And in order to make sure that the same amount does not encrypt to the same point on the curve twice, you make sure you have different randomizers added as well. There is no restriction on the randomizers, but the amounts obviously have to sum to 0 and cannot be negative, and so on. So that's why you need to have a zero-knowledge proof. The zero-knowledge proof, which is a bulletproof in practice, guarantees that the sum of inputs minus the sum of outputs equals 0. And moreover, that all the outputs are between 0 and 2 to the 32. Because if negative outputs are allowed, then other outputs can be too large. You forget about the negative outputs and spend the one that gives you $1 billion. So that's confidential transactions in one slide. So why does this protect privacy? Well, let's have a look at the transaction graph without confidential transactions. Since you can read off the amounts from the edges in this graph, it's really very easy to trace flows of money. But with confidential transactions, the numbers are missing from the edges in this graph. So you have no idea which nodes are holding this information. But you can exclude certain things. You can exclude many things, but there are still things you cannot exclude. And that's the point. All right, that's confidential transactions, technology number 1, up to technology number 2. I showed earlier that it's possible to use a zero-knowledge proof of knowledge of X that sends G to either P1 or P2 or P3. So whenever you were to use one of those zero-knowledge proofs to sign a message, that you need all 3 public keys to verify. But only one of the secret keys is what you need to generate the signature. So this signature is a zero-knowledge proof of knowledge of the secret key to one of these public keys, and it's zero knowledge because not only does the secret key remain secret, but which secret key it unlocks remains secret as well. Well, this is actually totally possible and has existed for a while, and yet Monero, it took Monero to finally implement this in practice. And the way it does it is using the same elliptic curve mathematics that I showed a few slides back. In practice, what happens is this is the list of explicit decoys that I mentioned earlier. So every time you make a Monero transaction, you use the secret key that matches the actual output that you're spending, and you're incorporating 2 other outputs as explicit decoys, and you're producing a ring signature that is verifiable only under the sum of all 3 public keys, but that hides which public key is actually being used. So if we go to the picture, what this looks like, or what its effect looks like on the transaction graph, here we have the transaction graph with confidential transactions. And now we're going to add ring signatures. That means that every transaction going from one node to another will now seemingly go from 3 nodes to that one node, with wires that are less certain. So in the end, you have the same number of nodes, but way more wires, way more edges connecting them, and none of these edges are actually certain because a lot of them were decoys intended exactly to confuse the adversary. All right, this is pretty good. But then Monero uses a third privacy technology called stealth addresses. And in order to see how stealth addresses work, I need to introduce some more mathematics. But don't worry, it's not that difficult. So we saw earlier the Schnorr signature scheme, where P is your public key. That's just X times the common public parameter G. And then, well, I guess technically the curve itself is also a common public parameter. So what if we take this picture and redraw the boundary slightly, such that only the curve is the common public parameter, but now G, the point you started from, is a part of the public key. This doubles the size of your public key, but your public keys are tiny anyway, so 2 times nothing is still nothing. But this change of boundaries actually implies a very useful property called public key re-randomization, which is this. You multiply both points by r. R is a uniformly random integer, and the result is 2 new points, G prime and P prime, and the observer is incapable of linking this pair to that pair because that requires solving the discrete logarithm problem. But the mutual relation between these 2 points on the curve is the same. So the same secret key can sign messages for this new public key. So that's really cool, because what you can do is when you send a Monero transaction to some address, which is a public key, what you're going to do is you're going to re-randomize that address first and send your Monero to that re-randomized address. So the effect is that 2 transactions to the same user cannot be linked. They seem indistinguishable from 2 transactions to 2 different users. This is what's called stealth addresses. And its effect on the transaction graph is that there are way more nodes that actually represent the same user. The number of wires stays the same, but since you have way more nodes, try figuring out where the money is, where Waldo is out of this mess. It's a lot more difficult. All right, that was Monero, actually. I covered the basics. Monero is what you get when you start from confidential transactions, hiding the amount, input-output amount, add ring signatures for the sender's privacy, and stealth addresses for the receiver's privacy. Add those 3 things, and you get Monero. That's it. All right. So what's this other technology called MimbleWimble that people are really, really excited about? Well, it goes back to confidential transactions. So this is the same slide as a few slides back. And the observation here is that once you take the sum of all inputs and the sum of all outputs and require that the sum is 0, well, then you have some number times the point h, because the point g disappears entirely by design. Otherwise, it's not a valid transaction. But if you have some number times the point h, well, that actually has the shape of a public key. So what happens if we use that public key to sign this message? It's totally possible. It does require interaction between the users on this side and the users on that side, because there's no one person who knows the secret key. They have to jointly collaborate to generate the signature and simulate knowledge of the secret key. But it's still valid, and they can only produce a signature on this transaction if the sum of inputs equals the sum of outputs. And, well, you still need to require that the outputs are all positive. This actually allows something really cool called cut-through, which happens when you have at least 2 transactions, possibly more, when the output of some transactions are also the inputs of other transactions. And we know for every transaction, the sum of inputs minus sum of outputs equals 0. So we might as well redraw our boundaries and require the same thing. Sum of inputs has to be equal to the sum of outputs. And the answer is yes, that totally does work. You can totally forget about individual transactions because you can merge transactions and thereby store less data. Of course, you still need to record things about the positivity of transactions, what's called a kernel of a transaction. But the whole point is that you have to store way, way less data than you otherwise would. This is called cut-through. This technique allows you to forget history, but people argue that it's very, very beneficial for privacy, and I disagree respectfully. I'd say in terms of privacy, this achieves confidential transactions in a more scalable way, but in terms of privacy, the dimension privacy is orthogonal to the dimension scalability. So in terms of privacy, it performs no better than confidential transactions. People imagine that since verifying nodes on the network don't need to remember history, that the attacker's view is just periodic Coinbase transactions and the UTXO set. But I can't think of an attacker who would be stupid enough to actually forget history. And the attacker who remembers history can remember the entire transaction graph. Not the amounts, because this is still protected by confidential transactions, but the structure of the graph remains known to the attacker. So the difference is that MimbleWimble achieves this structure with much less data. But this is still the view of the somewhat sophisticated attacker. So that brings me to the last privacy technology called QuizQuiz. This was proposed at Asia Crypt 2019. The idea here is that there is still a UTXO set, but now we require from the miners that every time they generate a new block, they compute the UTXO set as a result of all the transactions in that block. Those are the red dots. And then they shuffle the red dots and re-randomize them. The same mathematics that allows you to re-randomize public keys allows you to re-randomize UTXOs, and they are unlinkable. So as a result of all these transactions, the miner obtains the red dots, then he shuffles them and re-randomizes them and includes a zero-knowledge proof that he didn't add any new ones or take out any of the old ones. So that's a proof of shuffling. And the next block, the transactions start from those shuffled UTXOs. So every block actually cuts your transaction graph into pieces. In exchange, you do trust the miners to do some privacy preserving for you. And if all the miners collude, well, then you don't have any privacy, but generally speaking, you assume that at least 50% of the miners are honest. Every block randomizes the UTXO set. What I like about this design is that it's asymptotically scalable because there is still a UTXO set. Verifying nodes on the network can forget about history. And yet, somehow, they managed to engineer this such that your privacy grows with history. So if you're really enthusiastic, if you're really paranoid about the last 3 miners, and you think they might be recording your identity or your traces, well, just wait a few more hours. Sooner or later, you will have had an honest miner randomize your UTXO. So privacy grows with history. Unfortunately, there is a large cost associated with performing this shuffling and especially the proof of correct shuffling. So miners have a larger workload. On the other hand, we expect miners to do work anyway, so we might as well require them to do more work. So that's called quiz. That brings me to my conclusion slide, about which I'm very enthusiastic, because I summarize in 3 points what I wanted to get across in my 3 sections. Privacy is worthwhile and not evil. It is totally possible with the right technology, and the technology here in question is zero-knowledge proofs. But there are inevitable trade-offs, and you cannot get privacy for free. And that seems to be because there is this self-defeating circle where cryptocurrencies are useful if they have a lot of users, and it's the large number of users that make your privacy meaningful, because it's no use hiding behind the 3 other users of Zcash. So you want a lot of users because they give you privacy, and in order to achieve this privacy, you need not just users, but you also need heavy-duty cryptography, like zero-knowledge proofs and stuff. But the problem is this heavy-duty cryptography, to some degree, it attacks scalability, or it's not compatible with scalability. And yet it's the scalability that you need to attract more users. So in the end, the more you invest in privacy, the less you invest in users, the less you achieve privacy. So there is a problem here. There is a problem here. My research, or at least some of my research, revolves around this particular link. I like scalability, and I also like heavy-duty cryptography, and I especially like it when it's the heavy-duty cryptography that actually enables, as opposed to destroys, scalability. So this arrow doesn't always hold, it usually holds. And maybe if I'm really successful in my research, we can reduce that to sometimes. All right, that was my last slide. I wanted to take a picture, go ahead. So that was my last slide. Now is the time to open the floor for questions.